for today. Today's daf we're going to be learning is Yevamot Mem Tet. Today we actually have a pretty straightforward, more simple daf, and a bit of review of some things we've seen before, and we're going to learn them a little bit more in depth. So the Mishnah is going to start out with Ezehu Mamzer. Okay, what is a mamzer? When is a child born to some sort of improper union? When is it considered to be a mamzer? So we've seen this machloket before. We saw the Mishnah quoted a few days ago. Kol she'el basar shehu belo yavo divrei Rabbi Akiva. Okay, these words of Rabbi Akiva provide a lot of issues based on three words that appear here. The first three words, kol she'er basar. Any relative, any kind of close relationship that one has, shehu belo yavo, which is do not marry, right? Lo yavo b'kal Hashem, like things like that, where it says don't come into the community. That means don't marry. So what he basically means, and we saw this before, is any lo taseh, but it's not really any lo taseh, and this is what causes a bit of problem. A few days ago, we said it's any lo taseh. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. So what are the lo tasehs, right? For example, a mamzer can't marry in the community. You can't marry, right? There's certain, you can't marry a patsua dakar karuchuvcha, someone with a problem with his, with one of his, exactly how you describe those things, but there's some sort of problem there with the man's organs. So things like that aren't really included in these words because that's not she'er basar. That's not a relative. When we say a relative or relationship that causes, like Rashi gives an example. If you look in Rashi, he says kol kurvashi belav. Okay, the first Rashi on the page. Any relation that is right a close relative or something like that, which is a lo taseh. Even if it doesn't have karet associated with it, Kegon anusat aviv Rabbi Yehuda, which we're going to see later, which Rabbi Yehuda holds that anusat aviv, if your father had a relationship with a woman outside of marriage, either rape or just outside of marriage, that would be a lo taseh. That's a relative, right? A relationship. It's because you're close with your father that this woman is forbidden to you. But it wouldn't necessarily include like a grusha and a kohen, right? A divorcee and a kohen, because that's a lo taseh, but there's no relationship in there. What about a yevamah who goes and marries somebody else, right? She's not allowed to. So it's a little bit tricky, this language. And there's a bit of a debate about, does he really mean only relatives here that are lo taseh? Because before that, we understood Rabbi Akiva otherwise. So number one, we're going to see in the Gemara that there's two opinions about, in addition to this third one that I just explained about it only being a relative, there's two other opinions about Rabbi Akiva that we're going to see. There seems to be maybe a debate about what Rabbi Akiva actually held. That's some option. Rambam understands it as kol she'er basar, or anyone who's just below yavo. And then that would include that and that. Okay, so but then you have to change the wording a little because it's kol she'er basar vishehu below yavo. You'd have to add an end. So I just want to point out here that there's a little bit of complication in how to understand Rabbi Akiva here. It's not necessarily just simply any lo taseh, okay, but it's not clear. So now Rabbi Shimon Atimni Omer, I see you're asking Julie a question. We're going to get to it later. Shimon Atimni Omer, kol shechayavim alav karet bidei shamayim, halacha kidvarav. Two interesting things. First of all, he points out anything that has karet associated with it, and the halacha is like him. But this is very interesting because very often, very, very rarely does a Mishnah say the halacha is like him. So that's strange in and of itself. And it's going to be even more strange because we actually hold more like Rabbi Yoshua. And I can tell you why right now, because we're going to see that Rabbi Yoshua holds, maybe we'll just get there and then I'll tell you, Rabbi Yoshua mel kosh chayvim alav mitat beitin. Anyone who there's a court-imposed penalty. So one of the most famous court-imposed penalties, which is not karet, is eshet ish, which is a married woman. A man sleeps with a married woman. Now, if I asked you what a case of mamzer is, that's one of the classic cases of mamzer, where a woman is cheating on her husband, has a child with that man. That's a mamzer. And that's chayve mita beitin and not chayve karet. So it's interesting that even though it says halacha kedvarav, we don't actually hold like Rabbi Shimon or like Shimon Atimni. And some people explain here that this is a proof about how the Mishnayot were put together, because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put together Mishnayot that people, someone had this tradition that the halacha was with him, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi didn't write the Mishnah. He just compiled things that were already in existence and often kept them in their original form, even if he didn't necessarily agree with it, or the halacha didn't go that way. Okay, so we now have three opinions. One, chayvei lavim, which maybe all chayvei lavim, maybe ones that are only associated with familial relationships. Number two, karet. Number three, mitapetim. Now you're obviously wondering, well, what falls into what category, right? We discussed a bunch of the chayvei lavim, but what's the difference between the karet and the mitapetim? So what's very helpful usually in organizing these things is the Rambam. So if you look at the Rambam in Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah, which is in Sefer Kedushav, the Mishnah Torah, he starts to explain, okay? And he starts off in the very first thing you're going to discuss if you're talking about forbidden relationships. So, Haba lachat mikol arayot hamurot b'Torah b'mezid chayav karet. So first of all, he says, all the ones listed, okay, that if you're in Israel, you just read it last week in Yevamot, this past Shabbos, and if you're in Chutz La'aretz, you'll read it this coming week, which is all the list, right? It's always from and all that connects. So all the list of all the forbidden relationships. And at the end of that section, this is how the Rambam knows that it's all correct. It says, Shenemal, ki kol asher yaseh mikol ha'tovot ha'eleh v'nichretu hanefashot. Okay, so basically all the forbidden relationships are correct. So now it's a little tricky, because then why are you saying mitapetim? Well, we're going to see that even though all of them get karet, remember, karet is in the hands of God. There's also punishment for some of them in the court. And that's what Rabbi Yoshua comes and says, only the ones that are also punishable by the court. Not that he thinks you don't get karet for them, but he wants to say only the ones that are also punishable by court are going to be the ones that are mamzerim. But ones that are only karet are not. So now, if we skip a little bit to the next one, to halacha gimel, halacha daled. Harayot sheyesh behem mitapetim. Mehen shemitatam beskila, mehen shemitatam besklifa, mehen shemitatam bechenik. So now he's going to say of the ones, and he's going to now list. Okay, so it's very organized, the Rambam, in halacha daled of Hilchot Isurei Bi'ah, in the first chapter. He says, here's the list. Okay, some get stoning, some get burning, and some get strangulation. We've seen this actually in the beginning of the Masechet. Ve'elu shemitatam beskila, haba'al imo, one who sleeps with one's mother, al eshet aviv, his father's wife, al eshet beno, son's wife, v'anikret kalato, that's your daughter-in-law, v'ashochavim asachar, homosexual relations, v'ashochavim behema, with an animal. Okay, these are not going to have mamzerim issues. V'yisham, okay, that's and a woman who brings a behema on top of her. Ve'elu hen arayot shemitatam b'srefa. Haba, okay, burning. This is where you get burning. Haba bat ishto b'chaye ishto, the daughter of your wife while your wife is still alive. Al bat bita, granddaughter. Em al bat bina, granddaughter through her son. Val em ishto, the mother of his wife. Al em ima, on her mother, right? Your mother-in-law basically, and your grandmother-in-law. Ve al em aviha, okay, also through her father. Ve, right, her grandmother through her father. Ve haba al bito, val bat bino, your daughter, granddaughter, through whichever child. And the only one that gets strangulation is the eshet ish. Okay, so basically that's the punishments that are arayot, that are mitapetim. So according to Rabbi Yoshua, those are the only ones. And there's additional ones that weren't mentioned here that are karet, that ones the Shimon HaTimni would think. Okay, it would be helpful to organize an organized list. I didn't get to it, but that would be a good thing to do, to just have it in chart form. I didn't manage to find one. If someone finds one that's in existence, feel free to send it around. Okay, so now you have the three opinions, and which we said Rabbi Akiva's opinion is going to split into really three different opinions. Is it just relatives? Is it also, and we'll see two others, I won't give away yet what they all are. We'll get to it in the Gemara. Now, on the one hand, the Mishnah brought these three opinions, and in the middle one said the halacha is like Shimon HaTimni. On the other hand, they also bring a proof for opinion number three, Rabbi Yoshua. And we actually hold this way, so it's possible that also the Mishnah seems to be siding, or at least even though it said halacha like Shimon HaTimni, does seem to side a little bit on the side of this other opinion of Rabbi Yoshua, because it gives an actual a case. Okay, and we'll see where this case is. Amal Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Matzati Megillat Yuchasim b'Yerushalayim. I found a Megillah with lineages listed. Okay, this is very common. They had these lists of who descended from who, because it was very important to know, number one, who you can marry, who you can't marry. People cared a lot in those days, especially about, you being from a good family and being able to trace your lineage back many generations, and there was no slaves mixed in or something like that, or mamzering. So they kept these lists. So they found, he says, Shimon ben Azai says, I found the Megillat Yochsin in Jerusalem, v'katuv ba, and it said there, Ish ploni mamzel me eshet ish. It said the following person is a mamzel because he was born from a married woman with somebody else. So now they said you could have just listed he's a mamzer. You didn't need to say why he's a mamzer. The fact that they explain why he's a mamzer, which would, right, mitato bechenek, so there would be a case, right, where it's a mita beitin, it's from the court imposed punishment, and therefore that matches Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. So comes the Mishnah and states, or Shimon ben Azai says it, L'kayem divrei Rabbi Yeshua. It must have been written in this Megillat Yochsin that he's a mamzer from an eshet ish in order to tell you that we hold like Rabbi Yeshua. So again, there's halakha kidvarav by Shimon Atimni. On the other hand, this Megillat Yochsin, which is something, it's always when there's something tangible or a case or something like that, that proves it even more so. Now the Mishnah goes off on other arayot, seemingly a little bit unconnected to this part of the Mishnah. Ishto shemeta mutar ba'achota. We're now going to go over a halacha that we already know. Also, it was in this week's parsha, that if a woman dies, you're now permitted to her sister, because you remember it said you can't marry your sister. Lo isha lachota lo tikach litzror legalot ervata aleha bechayeha. This was a pasuk we darshaned a lot in the beginning of the Masechet, that you shouldn't, right? Because the litzror was the tzara, and we learned from there all sorts of stuff about Yibam. But the simple reading of the pasuk is, don't marry a woman and her sister when she is still alive. So that means when she's alive, you can marry her sister. But if she dies, you can. Now they want to just kind of make sure that you don't think that that maybe she's not called your wife once you would be divorced from her. So they want to tell you, if you divorce her, only when she dies are you permitted to the sister, but not if she's still alive. Even if you're no longer married to her, you still can't marry her sister while she's alive. Even if you take it one step farther, you divorced her, then she married somebody else. Mutar b'achota, you can still, right? Only once she dies, that marrying someone else doesn't help you. You still can't marry her sister, but if she dies after that, then you can. Yivim tosha meta, mutar b'achota. Remember that when she's a yevamah, even when he's just supposed to marry her, there's zika, remember? And then we said he can't even marry her sister in the case that, right? He can't do any one of them, actually, right? If two sisters fall to Yibam to him, or if he's supposed to Yibam with one, he can't marry the other because he has Zika to this one. Or obviously, once he decides to do Yibam with her and marries her, of course, he's forbidden to the sister. Chalatzla, if he did chalitza to her, also, remember we learned, achot chalutzato is forbidden as well. Even though he never married her, her sister's forbidden. But if meta, he did chalitza to her, and then she died, then mutar b'achota, only then would it be permitted. Nisei la'acher v'meta, if she married someone else after he did chalitza, that doesn't really matter. Only if meta, after all that, then mutar b'achota. So this Mishnah, a lot of this was unnecessary. We could have figured it out anyway, but the main point they're saying is only when she dies. Anything else that happens, even if you're not married to her, even if you didn't do yibum and you did chalitza, even if all those things, while she's still in this world, you're not allowed to marry her sister. Now the Gemara is going to start with Rabbi Akiva, and they want to figure out where Rabbi Akiva learns this issue, and then we're going to get to where Shimon Atimni and where Rabbi Yeshua learns it. And within Rabbi Akiva, we're going to see the two other opinions, and we're going to say where do they learn it, and everyone's going to learn it from the same verses, just in a different way. Okay, so where do they each learn their opinions? So to do this, you might want to open Dvarim chapter 23, verse 1. Okay, so in Dvarim chapter 23, and it's important to see this inside because you'll notice something right away that's a little bit strange. So if you open, let me open it myself. Okay. So in Deuteronomy 23, the first pasuk is Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv. A man is not allowed to marry his father's wife, which you might say, what's this doing here? Because it's in Vayikra, right? And all the parshiot that we're reading now. But it also says it here. This is in the context. The section before is about an aram or asaf. Somebody sleeps with a woman while she's engaged. And then it moves on to this. and then it's going to get to mamzer, and then it's going to get to Amoni or Moavi, all the people from other nations that you're not allowed to marry. So it says, Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv, you can't marry your father's wife. V'lo yigaleh knaf aviv. Okay, and you can't, now it's very unclear what this means. I'll read you from the English in Sefaria, for example. It's interesting the way they translate. So as not to remove his father's garment. Okay, in other words, the second part is describing the first part. This is an interesting commentary because it's definitely not the one the commentaries are going to go by. Commentaries are going to, the Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, they're going to view these as two separate things. Okay, but the English translation here, for example, says, right, no householder should take his father's former wife as his own wife so as to remove his father's garment. That's kind of like removing your father's garment. But they're going to understand that lo yigaleh knaf aviv is adding another lo taseh, another negative prohibition, and it's talking about something else, obviously, because we already said his father's wife. The interesting part is the next verse. It says, Lo yavo ptsua dakal kurt shufcha b'kal Hashem. I'll read the English. No man whose testes are crushed or whose member is cut off shall be admitted into the congregation of God. Then pasuk gimel is Lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem. A mamzer can't marry within the community. Gam dor asiri lo yavo lo b'kal Hashem. Even the 10th generation, right? Forever. So now, this is interesting. Why is it interesting? What they're going to do is they're going to say, oh, pasuk aleph and pasuk gimel, and they're going to ignore pasuk bet. That's why I wanted you to note this. If you look at it inside, you'll see this. They're going to ignore pasuk bet, and they're going to say, oh, smichut, right? Two verses that are juxtaposed to each other. We're going to learn that what appears in verse aleph, first verse, is going to be the criteria for mamzer, because then it says a mamzer can't come into the community. So therefore, mamzer is going to be learned out from verse 1. Now, how it's going to be learned out and which part of verse 1 is another question. Now, how can we just ignore pasuk bet in the middle if we're darshaning two things next to each other? Well, clearly someone who has crushed testicles, has issues with having children, is not going to be able to give birth to a mamzer. So therefore, they basically ignore that pasuk and say that pasuk clearly doesn't belong here because that person can't have children anyway. So obviously their offspring is not going to be mamzer. And they then say aleph and gimel go together. That's the theory. Now, you would think if you're going to say that, not like I read in the English translation, but the pasuk aleph is made of two parts. Which part is going to go closer to the mamzer, right? The part that's going to connect to the mamzer must be the second part because it's closer. That's at least the first way of thinking. Soon we're going to see one opinion connects the first part of the verse. Okay, and that's why we're going to have a machlok. So let's start with Rabbi Akiva. My time in Rabbi Akiva. Dichtiv lo yikach ish et eshet aviv v'lo yigaleh knaf aviv. That's the pasuk we just read. Kanaf shera'a aviv lo yigaleh. Right? So what does this mean? It means a kanaf, which again, how exactly you describe this, maybe a garment, as we saw in English, something shera'a aviv lo yigaleh, that his father saw you should not reveal. V'savra la ki Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, number one, he translated as this is adding something else. And v'savra la ki Rabbi Yehuda de'amal ba'anusat aviv ha'katuv medaber. And he held like Rabbi Yehuda. This is what we saw in the first Rashi that I read before. He holds like Rabbi Yehuda who held. There was a machloket about this pasuk. We'll see the other opinion soon. That anusat aviv, it's talking about not just eshet aviv that was in the first part of the pasuk, but when it added this additional, what it was talking about is anusat aviv. And that's where we get that it's a lo taseh. Remember Rashi said anusat aviv is only a lav, and that's what Rabbi Akiva is talking about. So that's what he's saying. Here's a lo taseh. Do not sleep with your father's either rape victim or a woman your father slept with out of wedlock, or outside of marriage. But now, so now he says, so now, if that's the verse, right, and it's talking about something that's just simply lav, it didn't appear on Usat Aviv in Vayikra when it talked about all these things of karet, and that's why, right, likewise the moms there, all these things, here are the Chayve Lavim. So there, it doesn't appear there, right? Obviously, you can't be saying it's talking about Eshet Aviv, because Eshet Aviv is more serious, right? That's listed in Vayikra. But this part is not, Anusat Aviv. V'samechle, and then here goes the smichut that I told you about. Lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem. Alma mehane have mamzer. So from here you learn, you have mamzer from Chayve Lamim. Now, I don't think he's saying you don't connect the first part of the pasuk, but he's basically saying, if you also connect the second part of the pasuk, you learn from here, right? Because according to Rabbi Akiva, it's everyone. chayve mitobetin, chayve kritut, and chayve lavim. They're all going to be mamzerim, and that he learns from these words, lo yigaleh knaf aviv, that it includes also a lo taseh like anusat aviv. Now, this would mean, what do we call this? We call this a chayve lavim that has to do with she'er basal, right? It's related to you because it's someone who is close to your father. So now we have to explain these other two approaches to Rabbi Akiva that I mentioned before. L'Rabbi Simai, we're going to have to explain, number one, what they say, and number two, where do they get it from in the verse then? L'Rabbi Simai, because this verse is referring specifically to someone who's a karov, a relative. U'Rabbi Simai demarbe shar chayve lavim delav she'er. Rabbi Simai holds the Rabbi Akiva, right? Holds within Rabbi Akiva. The Rabbi Akiva includes any lo taseh, even if it doesn't have she'er, not related to you at all. But any classic, right, like lo yavo mamzer bekal Hashem. So you marry mamzer, your child's mamzer. Lo yavo, right? All these lo tasehs. So now, where's he going to get it from? Ule Rabbi Yeshevav dimrabe afilu chayve aseh. Now we're going to learn there's other things. Like, for example, it comes up in that same chapter. If you opened up to the psukim, you'll see, right, there's lo yavo amoni moavi. So that's a lo taseh. But then it says, here, lo tita'ev, if you look in pasuk chet, 8, lo tita'ev edomi, ki achichahu, okay, don't despise the Edomi, the Edomites, because they're your brothers. Lo tita'ev mitzri, ki ger hagita baratzo, don't hate the Mitzrim, because you were a stranger in their land. Banim asher yivaldu lahem, dor shlishi yavo lahem bekal Hashem. Their children, only the third or fourth generation can marry within you. Now, what does that mean? It means you can't marry the first and second generation. So this is what you call an aseh. It's a positive commandment because there's no negative, don't marry them. But it says you can only marry third or fourth, which means you can't marry first or second, which means that's what we call a lav haba michlal aseh, a negative that you can derive from a positive, but it's not really a negative. So that also, Rabbi Yeshvav includes here, the child will be a mamzer as well. If you marry a first or second generation Egyptian or Edomite, then, right, so that's chayve aseh. He includes that your child will be a mamzer. Where do they both get that from then in this verse? Doesn't say any of that in this verse. Nafgaluhumi vilo. Could have said, lo yikach isha desha daviv, lo yigalek knaf aviv, like a comma in the pasuk, there's at naftas, take a break, and then say the second one. But you didn't need the word ve, the word or the letter ve, which right in English is a word and. You didn't need that. The and, we've seen this many times, comes to include additional cases. According to Rabbi Simai, it would include all chayve lavim, even if you're not related. And Rabbi Yeshevav would say it includes even chayve aseh, like the Mitzri and the Edomi. So now we have Rabbi Akiva's position. So we have three ways of understanding Rabbi Akiva. Is it just relatives? Is it all chayve lavim? Is it even chayve aseh? And we all learned them out from the second part of that verse, two of them from the Vav, and the rest from the case lo yigaleh knaf aviv, which is anusat aviv. And that only goes, by the way, according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of that verse, because the rabbis understand that verse differently, which we'll see in a moment. So Shimon Atimni, Savar ke Rabbanan. Oh, he holds like the rabbis. He doesn't think like Rabbi Yehuda that it's talking about anusat aviv, which means he doesn't think it's talking about a lo taseh. So he's going to have the same approach as Rabbi Akiva, just saying instead of saying lo yigaleh knaf aviv is talking about chayve lavim, he's going to say it's talking about chayve kritut. And then he's going to connect it to the mamzer pasuk, just like Rabbi Akiva did. So he's going to learn it from the same part of the verse, just understanding the verse differently. So he holds like the rabbis. When it says lo yigaleh knaf aviv, what it means is the woman who fell to yibum, to your father, you can't sleep with. Now, what's the reason for this? So Rashi says, and there's a bit of a disagreement about this, but Rashi says that they're talking about, why is a shomer yabam? Now, shomer yabam of your father is karet. Now, why is that? Right? Zika, if it's because of Zika, well, we already know there's a machloket about Zika, and it's not karet. But Rashi says, shomer yabam is forbidden to you because, not so much because she's shomer yabam, but she's your, remember this, eshet achi aviv, which means, very simply, your aunt, right? Your father's brother's wife. Very simply, your right? It's your uncle's wife. So your uncle's wife is the only one who falls to yibum to your father. Remember, it has to be through his brother. So your uncle's wife is forbidden to you karet. So that pasuk is talking about an isur karet, because she's forbidden to you, right? She might be permitted to the father because of Yibum, but she's not permitted to the son, because for the son, it's basically his aunt, okay, right? His aunt married to his uncle. So that's karet. If that's karet, then what do you learn here? So from there you get that it's chayve kritut that brings mamzer. Now we need Rabbi Yoshua. So Rabbi Yoshua is going to have a bit of a problem, because either the rabbis or Rabbi Yehuda, one thinks it's chayve lav and one thinks it's chayve kritut. Nobody thinks it's mito beitin, because in none of those cases do you get killed by the court. So he's going to have to darshan, be the one person who darshans this pasuk a little bit differently. So what does he say? He looks at the first part of the verse, okay? And he's going to connect the first part of the verse to the mamzer pasuk, okay? Which, like I said, it's a little less obvious, because you would think at least, yes, we have a break of pasuk bet in the middle, but at least the end of pasuk aleph connects with pasuk gimel if you ignore pasuk bet, because that obviously has nothing to do with mamzerim, as we said. But to connect the first part is a little bit less strong, but that's what he says. Lichtav Rachmana lo yigale lo yikach. Lo yigale lo yikach lamali. You could have just written lo yigale. Why did you have, right? Why do you have both? Lo yikach ish et esh David v'lo yigale knaf aviv. You could have really sort of put them together. So what does he say? Elalav hachi kamar. What they wanted to do is they wanted to give these two verbs to separate the first part from the second part and to say the following. Milo yikach ad lo yigale have mamzer. This is a way of basically, right, if you could put quotes, it would be a lot easier. But put quotes around lo yikach to eshet aviv until lo yigale, meaning the first, it's just an easier way of saying the first section is have mamzer. Tfei lo have mamzer. It's saying lo yikach, don't marry this woman. If you do, that'll be a mamzer. And the second part is just not. Okay, the second part is not a mamzer because he holds it's only when there's mita beitin. Now, eshet aviv is mita beitin. Okay, you will get killed by the court, and therefore, since that's mita beitin, we're going to learn from there. Only mita beitin are going to be mamzer issues. Okay, so that's right. First side of our daf today. We're almost about to turn the page. Very clear, organized structure. 3 opinions in the Mishnah. The Gemara goes into the 3 opinions, right? I'm ignoring the end part of the Mishnah about the sister, but also we have that. Then each one, where did they learn it from a verse? They're all learning it from the same verse, just in different ways. And within Rabbi Akiva, we saw 3 different approaches. Now comes Abaye, and he says, even though we have this big disagreement between the 3 of them, Amar Abaye, Hakol Modim, they all agree. And so, Julie, you asked this question before. Ba'al Hanida, the Ala Sota, She'en Havlad Mamzer. Let's go through each case. The first thing we're going to say, let's just explain it, and then I'll explain the cases. All agree that in these cases, a child born with this, right, from this union is not a mamzer. And then in a minute, we'll see why. Number 1, if a man sleeps with his wife when she's in nida, when she's menstruating, or even when she's not menstruating, when she's by Torah law defined as a nida, right, which would be the 7 days from when her period begins. So then the vlad is not a mamzer. Okay. And number 2, a sota. Okay, a sota is a woman who was unfaithful to her husband. She was with somebody else. He accuses her of being a sota. At that point, she can, and then let's say she's proven to be a sota, she's not allowed to stay married to him. What if she does? Let's say they stay married. If they stay married, okay, we'll see in a minute that halachically they're still married, okay, even though they're supposed to get divorced. If they had a valid marriage, so therefore their marriage, they continue to be called a married couple, even though they're not supposed to be married to each other. And if they have a child, that child is not a mamzer. Okay, even though by law they're not allowed to be married to each other. But since they were already married to begin with, their marriage is valid, right? You can't invalidate a marriage like that. So, right, you need a get basically to undo it, and he didn't give her a get. So, child is not a mamzer. So they all agree about this. So now they're going to say the reason is because in both these situations, tafse behu kiddushin. That means if someone were to betroth a woman like this, it would be valid. So it means a little bit of a different thing in each case. In the sota, it means what I said, which is their kiddushin is valid because it never was undone by a get or anything, and they're still married. My nida means something a little different. Nida daha tafse behu kiddushin shenema vatehi nidata alav. This is what we call a chupat nida. Okay, this is if a woman has is in her period of menstruating or hasn't gone to the mikvah before she gets married, that's called a chupat nida. Okay, I mean, she's in nida because she hasn't gotten out of it when they get married. So now this is a very interesting issue. Ideally, you're not really supposed to get married in that situation. However, we become very lenient about this because, first of all, right, there's a few issues. Number one, you're going to cancel your wedding last minute because she ends up in nida, and now what? Like all this money you spent is going to go to waste, right? It's a huge hefsed because you have a whole wedding plan. Number two, will be a little embarrassing to tell everybody, oh, listen, I have my period. We can't get married today. So because of that, they've been much more lenient about these rules and basically allow women to do this. We obviously try to avoid it and all sorts of, the dates planned based around it so that we don't end up with the chuppah nida. There's all sorts of complications about it because the couple is not allowed to be in yichud by themselves. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but the point is, if you were to have a marriage while the woman was in nida, the marriage would be valid, the betrothal would be valid, right? They're talking specifically about kiddushin here, which we do anyway under the chuppah, but the kiddushin would be valid. So therefore, since the kiddushin there are valid, and since in a sota, the kiddushin, right, your marriage remains, it's not canceled out, right? So to nami da tafsilu kiddushin. So because both these situations, because we talked about this before, in ein kiddushin tofsim, remember, even Rabbi Akiva, who says it even includes chai ve'lavim, it's because he holds the chai ve'lavim ein kiddushin tofsim, right? This is a big debate between him and the other rabbis. The other rabbis think, no, if let's say Yevamot goes and marries somebody else and doesn't marry the person she's supposed to marry, that's a chai ve'lavim. Her marriage will be valid, even though actually that maybe that was a bad example to bring because they're going to bring that one. But let's say a different chai ve'lavim, like someone marries anusat aviv, so the marriage will be valid. Again, Rabbi Akiva thinks it's not, and that's why he thinks the vlad is a mamzer, because that goes hand in hand. If the kiddushin is not valid, then their child will be a mamzer. Okay, so Tanya Namihachi, they now bring a braita to prove this. In other words, let's just get clear. Abaye is the one who said this, that everyone will agree. And now we bring a braita to prove it. But instead of 2 cases, they're going to bring 3. And that's why I say I shouldn't have brought the Yavam case, because that's exactly the case they bring here. And there's a machloket about it. So Tanya Namihachi, akomodim bebal nidava ala sota ve'al shomeret yavam she'en avlad mamzer. They also agree that if let's say your husband dies without children, you're supposed to do yibum with your brother-in-law, and you don't, and instead you marry someone else before taking care of either yibum or chalitza, so your child will not be a mamzer with that man. Okay, so according to the braita, everyone agrees about that also. So now they want to know, Abaye, who brought these 2 cases of the nida and the sota that are also mentioned in the braita, why did he bring the 3rd case? So Abaye shomeret yabam mesapka le'ike Rav ike Shmuel. Okay, there's a bit of a debate about what the debate between Rav and Shmuel is, but the simple reading is that Rav and Shmuel debate whether the kiddushin is valid or not in that case of the Yevamot. And therefore, since it was debatable point, he wanted to give something that wasn't a source of debate, and therefore he didn't bring it. Okay, but there are those who say in kiddushin tofsim, there are those who say kiddushin or tofsim, and therefore he didn't bring it as an example. Now we're going to end our daf with this interesting Megillat Yuchsin that Shimon ben Azai found. And we're going to see a different version of what appears in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, it just said, he found a Megillat Yuchsin that said, right, a document with lineages that said, this person is a mamzer because his mother was a married woman and slept with somebody else. But now we're going to see some other things mentioned in this Megillah. And we're going to go in depth and try to understand. Shimon ben Azai Omer. Okay, sorry, I skipped the word Tane. We have a braita. Shimon ben Azai Omer. Matzati Megillat Yuchasim b'Yerushalayim uchatuv ba. Ish ploni mamzer me'esh ish. Okay, that we already knew. That child is a mom, right? This person is a mamzer because his mother was a married woman. Ukatuva, and it says Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov kav v'naki. This comes up in a bunch of other places. That Rabbi Eliezer, I see people are nodding. You remember, some of you. So the Mishnah of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is kav v'naki. What exactly does that mean? It's a very good question. There's a lot of different interpretations. Most people say kav is a measurement. It's like a measurement of flour that's very fine, okay, that's very clean. It's very, which means basically he was very careful about passing down the Mishnayot, and therefore his opinions should be taken seriously. That's what most people explain. Some people explain in other ways, Kav is 102, and that there's only 102 cases that we hold by him. Even that wouldn't be too bad. Wouldn't complain if somebody held by me in 102 cases, but 102 cases, because in Gematria, Kuf is 100, bet is 2. And if that's what it means, there's a debate about what exactly this means, but okay, that's one thing. And another thing it says is Menashe harag et Yoshua. Okay, these three things seem to have nothing to do with each other. We go back into history. Yeshayahu, Isaiah, the prophet, he was killed by Menashe, the king. He was one of the last kings in the Judean reign, not of the last, but close to the end. And he was a terrible king. He was the son of Chizkiyahu, and he was a really bad king, and he killed Isaiah. Okay, now, what do these have to do with the Megillat Yuchsin? Why are they there? Some offer some interesting commentaries, like maybe Eliezer ben Yaakov, not maybe, he did. He has something saying Kiddushin about Mamzerut, so maybe that's why this is here. Whether it was about Yichus or Mamzerut, I don't remember exactly. And the Menashe harag Yeshayahu, saw that someone said they were related, and it was trying to say that even though Menashe had good Yichus, right, it doesn't always mean everything, right? So even though this is a book about Yuchsin, that you want to marry into a good family, it doesn't always mean, right? That's part of what Judaism is all about, right? The Bechor, the firstborn, is not always the best, even though they're supposed to be. And we have these ideals, but in practice, it doesn't always work out that way. So maybe those are nice creative possibilities. Oh, so there it is. Thank you. Yeshayahu's daughter married Chizkiyahu. Okay. So there you have that they were related. Okay, now, so here goes. We want to understand, why did Menashe kill Yeshayahu? Amal Rava. So Rava now gives us the background to this story. Meidan Dayane B'Katzli. He judged him in court and sent him to death. Okay, it wasn't just he said, "Oh, I'm going to kill this guy," but he brought him to court and he said, "You did 3 terrible things. We're going to see what they were. That you went against Moshe Rabbeinu." Okay, and this is just interesting in and of itself, this whole section. It's a total digression. Amar le, and it's fascinating in general. Moshe Rabcha amar ki lo yirani ha'adam b'chai. Moshe Rabbeinu said, nobody can see God and live, right? You can't look God in the face, right? This is what appears in the Torah. So now, it's really God speaking, but say Moshe said it, but it's really God speaking, right? Okay. Now, Adamar, Yeshayahu said, remember from Yeshayahu, right, in chapter 6, he has this Nibuat HaKdashah when he becomes a Navi, and he basically talks about this, what he saw of God. We learned all about this in the Maaser Merkavav. It's the Maaser Merkavav, right, which is really the Maaser Merkavav in Yechezkel, but in Yeshayahu, there's another one. And he says, Vayeret Adonai Yoshev al Kisei Ram b'Nisan. I saw God sitting on a big high chair. So how could you proclaim to have seen God if Moshe said, in the Torah it says, no one can see God and live? Moshe Rabcha amar mi kashem Elokeinu b'chol koreinu elav. Who is like our God every time we call to him? Meaning, you could always call out to God anytime you want. And you said you can only seek God when he is to be found, which sounds like not anytime you want, but in a particular time, which we'll have to see when that is. There's a famous chapter in Yeshayahu, which we read every time in the Haftorah of Mincha on a fast day. Moshe Rabcha amar et mispar yamechem aleh. Moshe said, you're going to basically live out your life. There's a certain amount of years a person is supposed to live. You went and prophesied to Chizkiyahu, v'hosafta al yamecha 15 shana. Since Chizkiyahu got sick, and then he brings the Navi, and then the Navi says, because you prayed to God, you will now live another 15 years. So how could you say God could give people extra 15 years when there's a certain amount of days people are supposed to live, a certain amount of years? So what did Yeshayahu do when he got put on trial? We obviously know he didn't win this trial. So what did Yeshayahu say? Amar Yeshayahu, he says to himself, I know he's not going to accept anything I say. He's going to kill me anyway. Okay, this court thing is just a way to get me killed. And if I argue against him and prove my point and why I'm right, I will turn him into an intentional killer. At this point, at least, he's just killing me b'shohei because he really maybe believes, or at least he has court to show for it, that I'm liable for the death penalty. But if I prove him wrong and then he kills me anyway, I will turn him into a rotzeach b'mezid, a murderer unintentionally, and I don't want to do that to him, right? You see how thoughtful he was about other people, so he said, I'm just going to avoid that. So what did he do? Amal Shem, he said the name of God, okay? The people use the name of God to protect themselves. So he says the name of God, and what happens, right? Magic trick. Ible ba'arza, he gets swallowed up into a cedar tree. But they saw what happened, and they took the Erez tree, the people of Menashe, and they shaved it. Okay, they shaved it down and basically killed him because he was inside the cedar tree. When they got up to his mouth, right, in that part of the tree, then he died. Why specifically there? Well, now we're going to see that Yeshayahu wasn't innocent entirely. He said the following line, which was derogatory toward the Jewish people. He said, in the middle of a nation with Tamei Sfatayim, impure lips, meaning they say things that are inappropriate, I am living, and he was derogatory toward the Jews, and he shouldn't have said that. Because he said that, he was punished. That when they got to his mouth, that's when he died. Mikomakom. So now they say, okay, we got the story, but Mikomakom, Kashu Kraya Hadadi. What interests us more than this story, or possibly, is how do we deal with these contradictions? They're good contradictions, it seems pretty valid against him. So what could he say to protect himself? So we're going to get to two of them today, and the third one we'll get to tomorrow. Ve'er et Adonai, Keditanya. This is very, very famous. Moshe Rabbeinu nistakel ba'aspaklaria ha'me'ira. Right? Everybody looked at God. Now, how do we explain this aspaklaria? There's all different interpretations. Right? The Rambam says it's basically like a glass that you can see through very clearly. And everyone else looked through this glass that was not, right? You couldn't see through so clearly. So it's true, he saw God sitting on a chair, but he saw God very unclearly. And only Moshe was at the level where he could see God in a much more clear manner. Okay, there's different ways of understanding this. I'll leave it at that. The Rambam's one of the most famous, where he talks about it in Shemona Prat. Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, habi yachid, habi tzibur. An individual can only reach out to God when God is found. A community can reach out to God at any time. It doesn't mean you can't pray at any time. The point is that God is more found toward an individual's prayer in a particular time of year. The Yachid Emat, when is this time? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, Elu Asara Yamim Sheben Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. This is what we call Aseret Yemei Tshuva. That's why they're called that, because, right, these are the days where God is more found to call out to him. So that's why we pray more during those times. But a community has a strength of prayer that can be heard at any time. So where do we get this from in the verse? Because Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo kra'u b'yoto karav kra'u is in the Lashon Yachid, and also the continuation of those verses is singular form. So they say that pasuk is singular. You can also prove it from the text. Okay, the last one we're going to see tomorrow, which is that Mispar Yamecha Malei Tinayi. There's actually Machloket Tanaim about this, which we'll see tomorrow, and they're going to quote a Braita. It's going to talk about that, and we will figure this out in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a great day.